Our next speaker is Mr. Richard Trifan, Vice President, Government Relations and Trade, the Eurasia Center, Washington, D.C.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to try to, and thank you to the Schiller Institute for putting together this very overarching and comprehensive view of the Silk Road. Last week I spoke in London about the issue of global sustainability, which I'll be talking about today. And what I mean by sustainability is not the sustainability of the cultural exchange, because this has been going on for millennia. I'm speaking of the sustainability of the actual infrastructure and information flow and the movement of goods, services, people, and transborder crossings that the Silk Road Belt will achieve. This is a historic project, as you all know. It is probably the biggest global achievement, which is analogous to reaching out into space and to the moon and to other planets. It's probably the most comprehensive initiative that many nations will be working together on. And the sustainability of this becomes paramount because the investment of money will be in the tens of billions of dollars or more. And therefore, the reliability of the completed network is going to be essential to preserve. And this is what I want to address. I've got 8 slides, and each one I'll take about 2 or 3 minutes just to point out some of the potential areas that can be overlooked and exactly the way to not overlook it and build it into each program. Okay, in this slide, we talk about the global, the sustainability across the host nations. I don't think I need the microphone. I think I talk loudly enough. So for one thing, the succession planning is an important part of thinking about how the capital assets are going to be built, how they're going to be deployed. And what I mean by succession planning is, it is far more than any one corporation or university even. This is a generational succession planning. It has to be planned, not only the education of the people to run it, but the right types of skills on a multi-generational basis for each nation to be able to coordinate their efforts to be able to maintain the reliability of the whole network. And this requires a degree of collaboration and cooperation across governments, not only at the ministerial level, but also at the university level, turning out the right level of graduates in the right engineering sciences, decisions about who will maintain what section of road. And if we just tick down some of these bullets here, the OpEx spend can be reduced what is called degradation planning. And this is basically a reliability concept, and that is any complex infrastructure, any bridge, any tunnel, any ship, any train, obviously deteriorates at an accelerating rate over its life cycle. And the importance of this is that money called OpEx, that's operational spend as opposed to the capital investment, this OpEx can be greatly reduced through the planning to this degradation curve. Over the first 5 years, it's not going to degrade that much. So the regularity of the inspections and the cost of maintaining those inspections can be spaced out in further apart sections, if you can picture that. Then as assets age, the speed of decline of any mechanical assembly is going to accelerate. And this is where, unless this is planned in, this is where you have operational failures. And on the scope of the Silk Road, think of the impact if one sector interrupts the flow across all the nations who are expecting their raw materials to move, their finished goods to move, the information superhighway that may go along with it, the pipelines that may go along with it, the information flow, the solar energy that will be able to be captured along this whole right of way, wind power, solar power, to name 2, constantly putting energy back into the system. So we cannot have any failures over the 50, 100-year time cycle. So this is why the life cycle of every component of the Silk Road infrastructure needs to be known in advance, and the amount of spending done to do your periodic inspections has to be profiled to ensure that as any part of this network reaches the end of its life, the inspections are now more frequent so they can be replaced before they fail. And this is an important concept. So every nation has to build this in to building their section of it. The infrastructure vendors' warranty stipulations must be built into the maintenance strategies of the superstructures, namely your rail guideways, which we're all familiar with, all the signaling, which is going to be satellite-driven and GIS-driven, as well as along the right-of-way, all the information guideways that you see the components there, the passenger guideways, the overland bridges, the roads, and all the stations and the border facilities. If there is going to be people traveling or goods and services have to depart from the Silk Road at any point along it, all of this infrastructure has to be planned out and built. And again, the life cycle of every component has to be known in advance, and the vendors who supply this have to be put on notice and have to be responsible to meet their stipulated lifetimes in order for the reliability of the Silk Road to serve everybody that it's intended to. Okay, now another decision to be made is the international set of standards, because if you have such an infrastructure across all these nations, all of the host nations will have some degree of standard. Certainly China does, certainly European Union does, the Eurasian Economic Union does, but decisions have to be made because the whole guideway has to be maintained to an identical standard that's been agreed upon. And there's challenges in terms of what is going to be a common language if communication is needed across the nations, again, to make sure of the contiguity of the whole network. The geospatial definition of segments and provinces are important. For GIS connectivity with satellite to be able to position every vehicle on the Silk Road, whether it's a road vehicle, a rail vehicle, even a ship vehicle in the maritime belt, decisions have to be made whether or not to use overland superstructures or tunnels, as an example. So the strategy for construction has to go through national approval, provincial and city approvals. The workforce can either be imported, it can be local, or a combination. And this is also very important because this is also a multi-generational responsibility. Certain nations will take the lead in certain aspects of the construction, but over the next 20 years, the next 50 years, the responsibilities might seem to fall then logically to each host nation's section. So those nations want to be able to gear up and turn out the right engineering graduates in the right specific sciences, technology sciences, engineering sciences, and so forth, to be able to optimize their section. So again, there's no failure, which lets down all the users of this whole great construct. So the strategy for sustainability has to include designing templates for each superstructure, subassembly, and component. And the alignment with educational institutions is important because you want to know that each nation is going to be cultivating the right graduates capable of taking ownership when they come of age. Okay, so just a few more points on the different standards that are used. Now let's talk about some of the national and privatization issues that will come up. In Germany, for example, you have Deutsche Bahn and you have private rail. Well, in each one of the nations through which the belt will traverse, you have varying degrees of maturity of national rail, national road systems, and so forth. So there's always going to be a competition between a national construct and the private enterprise. In England, for example, in the Network Rail segment that goes from south of London all the way up to Scotland, they have come up with a combination of private and public maintenance, which actually works pretty well. So this is, again, another area of planning to consider. Now, just to talk about the various manufacturers, we all know who they are. Alstom, Siemens, Bombardier, Regina, Sifang, Shinkansen, Kawasaki, to name a couple. But then let's look at the power. Let's look at the propulsion. The propulsion along the whole Silk Road as planned is not going to, at this time, be able to be one means. Not all the segments are able to go full electrification. There may have to be some diesel-powered segments to start. Now, this, of course, is only true for the rail infrastructure. But obviously, maglev, magnetic levitation, is a new technology and certainly one to consider. But the propulsion technology is going to have to be phased in as it matures, and various sections of the built road, the Silk Road, are going to have to be able to be revved up from one technology to a newer one. And this all has to be planned out and synchronized, not just by the minister of any one nation, but by the whole panel of all the nations represented, such that the synchronization and the replacement and upgrading of the propulsion technologies, again, don't interrupt business continuity. Because for many businesses, this completely opens up a nation's raw materials or finished goods markets. Raw materials going east, finished goods going west, or the reverse. Each nation, as the previous speaker mentioned, wants to evolve more to a higher level of manufacturing. Well, so that's why the business continuity is so important. And the propulsion technology is going to have to evolve, and it's going to have to be a combination of technologies at the present time until all the nations involved are able to support the more and more advanced propulsion. Okay, the sustainability, I've already touched upon the education aspect in engineering and technology. In order for it to last a certain specified life cycle, the local education must be offered at universities, engineering schools, secondary and trade institutions. Now, the contractor nations who are bidding at this time on the construction will at some point pass responsibility for the yearly maintenance to another party. Logically, people within the nations through whom that segment runs. So this is the assumption. This is one assumption of sustainability. What is needed is an asset lifetime commitment to maximize the capital investment and the realized return on the Silk Road assets. This is a simple ROA concept, but on a global scale, that's never been done before. The parameters of the engineering technology should dictate the training programs required to educate the successive generations, for example, to maintain each nation's segment, as I mentioned before. So this is a huge impetus to each nation's education aspect, and the ministries of each nation's education budget should receive a big infusion for this. And this is a very good payback to the people of each nation, to be able to say, not only are we going to improve your ability to move goods and services, east and west, but also lift up your whole educational level, or maybe offer some government-sponsored, some kind of an education which admits everybody. So also it's important to think that, to conceptualize and maintain the multinational infrastructure realization program in a panel, to drive this maintenance education, to keep pace with the technologies. Because again, each government cannot perform this, in a silo, so to speak. Each ministry's planning groups have to plan this, but they have to do so with an almost unprecedented level of collaboration with 6 or 7 nations which have all been under different forms of government over the last couple of decades. And over the next couple of decades, or the next 50 to 100 years and beyond, are going to have to keep working together, regardless of what changes or evolution will occur in those government systems. Okay, the request for proposals across the nations, decisions have to be made. Is there going to be one nation who is putting out the bids for the various services for the initial construction? And more importantly, the proposals that go out for the continued maintenance of the reliability of the whole system. The evaluation standards for the contractors, for the investors, for the linear labor, the people actually working on the right-of-way. Initial build versus long-term maintenance. Which nations will preside? I mean, we all know that obviously China is supremely capable of constructing this, but it almost seems as if it's correct for the ongoing maintenance of this, for the responsibility to pass to each host nation. So they can take the pride in this piece of work that, again, is global in scale and hasn't been done before. The investor financing, we obviously know that some of the nations involved are able to put up a large part of the financing. There's public-private partnerships, otherwise known as P3. There's also inward investment, which each nation makes themselves. There's also national and local investment to be made from a municipality, from a city, for example. There are multinational revenue and investment quality auditing panel as the Belt and Road matures. Anyone who invests in it is going to want to know, for example, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD. In last month's forum in London, where I spoke about the same issue, they are very eager to make the investments, but they're looking for this return. How will those financial documents look? What criteria are they going to base the realization of that investment? Repair or replace decisions, that's a decision we face every day. Again, at this scale, it may seem easier to repair something, but maybe it's time to replace it. Again, remember what I said before it fails. So that's very important, because everyone is going to be relying on this, because it's literally going to open the doors to the rest of the world for these nations. Okay, some more points on sustainability. The sustainable operations continuity, or uptime as we call it, the return on investment and the return on asset is extremely significant, if for no other reason that the reliability of the whole network is basically the promise and the commitment that we're making to these countries. The end-to-end satellite, whether it's going to be GIS or CBTC, computer-based train control, on each road, every point, when you have a run in a tunnel, the tunnel may lose connectivity with the satellite. Now, these sound like engineering details, but the important point is no one nation can make the decision. The decision really has to be made by the whole panel. I mentioned common language, traffic controllers. Will we trust computers to run this whole thing? I don't think so. So, exactly. So just as the FAA, just as the federal, the aviation industry arrived at a common language of English, almost arbitrarily, but the important point is there has to be no failure in international communication. Again, from an operations standpoint, from a scheduling standpoint, from a safety standpoint. So that decision needs to be made. Incidents and accident resolution, should there ever be an incident or an accident, how it's going to be resolved, all has to be modeled out in advance. Because by the way, that's a critical criteria for international banks to make these investments. It's an obvious risk reducer for them to insist that all these scenarios be modeled. The infrastructure life cycles, phase monitoring. Should we have a panel doing it or each nation performing it? Well, it's a combination of the two. Each nation is going to have a local panel, which then is going to have to report up to some entity that's responsible for the end-to-end continuity. The life cycle of the fleet. Again, succession planning. I mentioned propulsion technology as the roads age, and forming the improvement strategy, not only to maintain the performance, but to improve the performance, relying more and more on green energy as time goes forward. And I already mentioned that a lot of solar power and wind power can be captured along the right of way. But this is going to require, again, very big collaboration across these countries. Okay, so that's what I have. And if you have any questions later, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.